step with me for a moment into the hushed air of a Victorian nursery. Picture it not as the kind of cozy, pastel-coloured room modern parents would design with plush rugs and bins of toys, but as something far stranger. In Victorian London, or in the sprawling countryside homes of the well-to-do, the nursery wasn't designed to comfort children. It was designed to shape them. It was a place where childhood was treated like an obstacle course, where every detail, down to the wallpaper on the walls, came with rules, expectations, and in some cases danger. To be a child here was to live under a constant gaze, watched not just by parents but by nannies, governesses, and a rotating cast of relatives who believed kids were naturally flawed and needed firm correction. Now, let's pause on that idea for a second. Today, we often see children as innocent, full of imagination and goodness, with mischief brushed off as part of growing up. But the Victorians thought differently. They believed that children were born sinful, their little outbursts of energy or misbehavior signs of a darker, selfish nature. To them, a child who laughed too loudly or spoke out of turn wasn't just being playful. They were showing evidence of wickedness that had to be corrected. Imagine being 6 years old and treated like a moral project rather than a kid figuring out the world. That's the foundation of the Victorian nursery, love mixed with suspicion, affection tangled with discipline. Walking into one of these nurseries, you'd notice the rules before you noticed the toys. Silence was golden, joy was rationed, and discipline hovered over everything like a shadow. The adults who ran the nursery saw themselves as guardians of not just health but of souls. They believed every impulse needed controlling, every whim redirected. If you fidgeted, you were scolded. If you shouted, you were punished. And if you dared to cry too long, there was likely a spoonful of some syrup waiting. One that promised peace but hid a dark secret in its ingredients. The nursery was a crucible, a place where children were expected to shed their instincts and grow into tiny adults long before they were ready. The space itself didn't help much. Those bright floral wallpapers that looked charming at first glance often hid poison. Literally, one popular pigment of the time, known as Victorian green, was made with arsenic. It coated walls, curtains, even toys. Over time, the pigment flaked into dust, filling the air children breathed and settling on their fingers. In damp weather, the wallpaper could even release poisonous gas. Parents didn't realize they were decorating their nurseries with a silent killer, but the results were chilling. Kids developed rashes, breathing problems, or worse, and families chalked it up to mysterious childhood ailments. The irony was painful. In trying to make rooms look beautiful, they had turned them into slow, quiet traps. And yet, life went on. The nursery wasn't just a room for sleep and play. It was a child's entire world. It was where they woke in the morning to the sound of Nanny's sharp footsteps, where they lined up for lessons in manners, where they tiptoed through games designed more for education than joy. Picture rows of alphabet blocks painted in bright colours, lead-based of course, that could chip and end up in little mouths. A rocking horse in the corner, paint peeling, waiting to splinter. Dolls with porcelain faces and glass eyes that watched from the shelves. Even the toys reminded children that play was a privilege, not a right, and that joy often came with a price. Imagine yourself as an 8-year-old in this world. You wake to the sound of rustling lace curtains, heavy and stiff with dust. The air smells faintly of boiled milk, disinfectant, and something you can't quite name. Perhaps cod liver oil. Your nanny, a woman whose starched uniform is as unyielding as her stare, is already moving about, keys jangling from her belt. She's not your mother. She's not even family. Yet she's the one who will oversee your every move. From the way you fold your hands at breakfast to how quietly you play in the corner. Parents, in many wealthy homes, drifted in and out of the nursery like distant figures. Their role was to guide with lofty words and occasional scoldings, but the true daily authority was always the nanny. Children didn't just exist in these nurseries, they performed. Every gesture, every glance carried meaning. Sitting still was a sign of obedience. A bowed head meant respect. Even walking had rules. Tiptoe, not stomp. Keep your back straight, your hands folded, your expression calm. Idle hands are the devil's workshop, adults like to say, and so even moments of rest had to be filled with something useful. Sewing, handwriting practice, or silent reading from a moral tale. Joy wasn't outlawed, exactly, but it was discouraged. A giggle could be interpreted as disobedience. A game with too much energy might be shut down with a glance sharp enough to stop your heart. And yet, kids being kids, there was always mischief bubbling under the surface. They whispered jokes into teddy bears. They tried to sneak crusts of bread into secret games. They even invented ways to outsmart the constant rules. Some pretended to embroider when really they were plotting where to bury the finished handkerchief later. Others found ways to turn moral poems into silly rhymes, whispered so softly even the most watchful aunt couldn't hear. Beneath the stiffness and fear, childhood refused to vanish completely. It clung on in stolen giggles, in quiet rebellions, in the stubborn hope that one day they'd grow big enough to escape the nursery altogether. But the adults believed these restrictions were acts of love. Remember, they lived in a world of high infant mortality. In some cities, 1 in 5 children didn't live to see their first birthday. Imagine the grief that created, the constant awareness that every joy could be fleeting. Some parents kept emotional distance as a form of self-protection. Others doubled down on discipline, convincing themselves that strictness would save their children not just from death but from sin. In that mindset, punishments were proof of care. Cold baths, strict diets, silent rules. All of it was seen as a way to build strong, moral citizens. Affection was measured not in cuddles, but in corrections. So the nursery, as strange as it seems to us, was a mirror of Victorian anxiety. Parents and nannies weren't trying to be cruel for cruelty's sake. They were wrestling with fear of illness, fear of social disgrace, fear that their children might grow wild and untamed in a world that demanded order. In that fear, they created a childhood full of contradictions, beautiful on the surface, terrifying underneath, poisonous wallpapers beside cheerful dolls, sweet lullabies followed by stern punishments, a kiss from a mother through a hole in the floorboards so as not to disturb the child, tender but distant all at once. To step into a Victorian nursery, then, is to step into a paradox. It was a place of lace and lace-bound rules, a room that looked soft and delicate but demanded hardness from its little occupants. It was the setting for countless childhoods where survival meant learning to stay quiet, stay small, and grow up faster than you should have. And as strange as it all feels now, it was normal then. Normal enough that entire generations grew up with it, carrying both scars and strengths into adulthood. And that's just the beginning. We've only set the scene, only peeked into the doorway of Victorian parenting. There's still so much more waiting: the dreaded breakfasts, the endless discipline, the dangerous medicine cabinets, the toys that doubled as hazards, and the bizarre ways parents tried to keep kids safe. All of it adds up to a world that would look illegal today, but was completely ordinary back then. It's morning now, and you're being marched from the nursery down the hall toward the dining room. Your hands are freshly scrubbed red with cold water, your hair brushed into obedience, and your belly already growling. You might hope for something warm, filling, maybe even sweet, but hope is not on the menu here. No, in a Victorian household, the first hurdle of the day is breakfast. And it isn't meant to make you smile, it's meant to test your spirit. The meal waiting on the table is gruel, a grey, lumpy porridge that looks like punishment in a bowl. Sometimes it's made of oats, sometimes barley, sometimes whatever grain was cheapest and easiest to boil. It has no sugar, almost no salt, and certainly no joy. If you're lucky, there might be a lonely raisin floating in the mush. But you squint at it for a long moment, because in this house, a raisin and a dead fly look suspiciously alike. The adults insist this gruel is good for you. They say it builds character, cleanses the body, strengthens the moral backbone. It's not about the taste. It's about teaching you to accept discomfort with dignity, and that's the Victorian way. Every spoonful of misery is somehow an act of love. Flavor is seen as indulgent, sweetness is suspicious, and a child who enjoys their meal too much might be accused of gluttony, or worse, weakness. So you sit in silence, the spoon heavy in your hand. Around the table, your brothers and sisters are locked in the same private battle with their bowls. There's no chatter, no laughter, no casual, pass the butter. In fact, butter is only for guests, jam is locked in a cupboard, and sugar is as rare as a fairy tale. Conversation at breakfast is allowed, but only in Latin, or when correcting someone's table manners. Imagine being 8 years old and having your only breakfast conversation be about elbows and posture, and the gruel. It changes texture with the day. Sometimes it's so watery you can drink it. Other mornings it's thick enough to lay bricks with. You never know which version will land in front of you. What you do know is that you're expected to finish it. Leaving food behind isn't just rude, it's a moral failing. So you eat, spoon after spoon. The taste is something like wet cardboard soaked in Monday mornings. It clings to your teeth, sticks in your throat, and feels more like survival than sustenance. If you dared to complain, you'd be met with sharp looks and sharp words. Don't be ungrateful, they'd say. Children in the workhouse would be thankful for this. And they'd be right in a grim way. For poor children, gruel wasn't a punishment. It was the only thing keeping them alive. Thin soups, scraps of bread, watery pea stew. These were the daily diets of kids who rose before dawn to work in factories or sweep chimneys. For them, food was survival fuel, not philosophy. But for wealthy families, it was different. They had other options. There could have been eggs, meats, pastries. Yet many parents chose gruel on purpose, believing it toughened children. Imagine that, eating peasant food not because you had to, but because it supposedly purified your soul. It's one of those strange Victorian contradictions, the wealthy copying the hardships of the poor, but only in carefully measured doses. And the rules don't stop with food. Your posture is policed just as much as your plate. Sit up straight. Keep your napkin neat. Don't lean too far toward the table, but don't lean back either. Hands are for holding spoons, not for fidgeting. If your boot scuffs the table leg, you'll get a glare that could shatter glass. Breakfast isn't just a meal, it's a lesson. Every bite reinforces obedience. Every swallow is a reminder that childhood in this house is less about fun and more about preparation for adult life. Every so often, a newspaper rustles at the far end of the table. Father folds a page with a dramatic snap, sipping his tea, and you know better than to interrupt. A sigh from mother floats across the room when someone stirs their gruel too loudly. Even the family dog, curled by the fire, has given up begging for scraps. It knows there's no joy to be found at this table. On rare days, holidays, birthdays, Queen Victoria's Jubilee, you might be treated to something extra. A bruised apple cut into slices and divided among siblings. A small knob of butter stirred into the gruel for richness. A dab of jam appearing like treasure from the locked cupboard. But these moments are rare, rationed carefully, so they feel like miracles. And they remind you, painfully, of what you're missing the rest of the year. The philosophy behind all this is clear: food is a tool. It's not about taste, not about health in the modern sense. It's about teaching discipline. A child who learns to endure tasteless meals without complaint will, in theory, grow into an adult who can endure hardship, resist temptation, and carry the weight of social duty. At least, that's what the Victorians told themselves. And so every morning, thousands of children sat down to bowls of grey mush and chewed their way toward virtue. By the time breakfast is done, you don't feel energized, you feel defeated. But in that defeat, adults saw success. You've been reminded that life is not about comfort, that joy is fleeting, and that character is built spoon by spoon. You push your bowl away, hands folded neatly, waiting to be dismissed. And as you rise from the table, stomach heavy but unsatisfied, you know the day has only just begun. because this wasn't just breakfast. This was the first test in a long line of daily obstacles. Next would come the lessons, the silence rules, the discipline, the endless drills that shaped a Victorian childhood. And if you survived it all, without laughing too loudly, without spilling your gruel, without daring to dream of jam, you might just make it to lunch. The meal is over, the bowls of gruel cleared away, and the air in the dining room grows heavy with unspoken rules. This is when you're reminded of one of the most famous sayings of the Victorian age: children should be seen and not heard. You've probably heard that phrase before, maybe from an older relative, but in the Victorian home it wasn't just a quip. It was law. It was survival. Imagine yourself sitting at that long wooden table, the sound of father's newspaper folding echoing like thunder, mother's sigh floating across the room like a storm warning. You want to ask for more milk. You want to tell your sister about the funny face the dog made. You want to giggle at your brother who has gruel stuck in his hair. But you don't. You can't. One sound, one misstep, and you risk the sharp sting of shame, or worse, the dreaded punishment chair waiting in the hall. So you learn early silence is safety. The rule wasn't born from cruelty alone. Families in this era were often big. Middle-class and wealthy households might have 4, 6, sometimes 8 children. Imagine all of them packed around the same dinner table, along with parents, grandparents, and maybe a maiden aunt or two. Without silence, chaos would reign. Bedlam, they called it, so silence wasn't just about obedience, it was about order. And order, in the Victorian mind, was everything. From the moment you left your bed in the nursery, silence followed you like a shadow. Walking through the halls, step only on the rug runner, never the creaky boards. Moving past the drawing room, keep your back straight, your hands folded, and your eyes politely downcast. Your job was to pass through the house like a ghost, small, invisible, careful not to disturb the fragile piece of adult life. And it wasn't only in the home. Schools enforced the same rule. Classrooms were filled with straight-back desks, little hands folded, little mouths sealed shut. No speaking unless called upon. No questions unless you wanted to be seen as defiant. Even playtime had limits. Laughing too loudly could be considered unladylike or unruly. Running indoors was enough to earn a lecture about the dangers of excess enthusiasm. Childhood itself was treated like something noisy and messy that had to be scrubbed clean. But children are children, and silence doesn't come naturally. You want to laugh, you want to shout, you want to share secrets. So what happens? You learn tricks, you whisper behind cupped hands, you turn giggles into coughs, you invent entire games of silent communication, a look, a shrug, a kick under the table. The art of being a Victorian child wasn't just about learning your letters. It was about learning invisibility. The house itself became a training ground. The drawing room, for example, was a minefield. Technically, you were allowed inside, but only if you moved like furniture. You sat stiff-backed, hands on your lap, eyes down. You tried not to look at the biscuits on the sideboard, even though they were as tempting as forbidden treasure. Aunt Prudence sat watching from her chair, and one fidget, one wiggle, one stifled laugh was enough to bring her sharp sigh crashing down on your spirit. Dinner in particular was like walking into a final exam. The adults spoke of church attendance, politics, the price of coal, or the progress of the Crimean War. You sat quietly, chewing slowly, careful not to clink your spoon too loudly against the bowl. If spoken to, you answered in crisp, complete sentences: yes, father. No, mother. I'm terribly sorry, grandmama. There was no room for storytelling, no space for jokes. Unless, of course, your joke involved Greek mythology or a polite pun about sherry. Otherwise, silence was the safest response. If you forgot this rule, the consequences were swift. You might be banished back to the nursery to copy handwriting drills. You might be placed in the reflection chair, staring at a picture of a weeping angel, until you understood your sins. Or, perhaps worst of all, you'd face the humiliation of a long parental lecture. The Victorians loved their lectures. A father could speak for half an hour about the dangers of noisy children, weaving in references to debtors' prisons, the decline of society, and why loud laughter was dangerously French. By the end, you'd be nodding, apologizing, promising never again to raise your voice above a whisper. Shame was the strongest weapon of all. One disappointed look from mother could wither your soul. A raised eyebrow from father could make you doubt your entire life's choices at the age of 7. Even the family dog seemed to glare at you if you broke the code of silence. This wasn't just discipline. It was training, emotional, psychological training to mold you into the perfect adult calm, contained and unflinchingly polite. But silence came with a cost. Imagine what it does to a generation of children to grow up in constant quiet. To be told every day that your voice isn't wanted, your questions aren't needed, your laughter is dangerous. Many of these children grew into adults who were masters of the poker face, able to sit for hours without revealing a single thought. But they also grew into people who struggled to express themselves, who bottled up feelings until they burst out in other, sometimes darker, ways. And yet, just like with the gruel at breakfast, there was always a paradox. Because in some ways, silence also built resilience. Kids learned to read rooms like seasoned diplomats. They could sense a mood shift in the adults before a word was spoken. They knew when to step forward, when to vanish, when to stay perfectly still. It was survival, yes, but it was also a kind of training in observation and subtlety. Skills that might later help them navigate the rigid social world of adulthood. Of course, children found ways to reclaim their voices, whispered secrets under blankets at night, quiet giggles shared with siblings after Nanny's footsteps faded down the hall, silent rebellions that proved joy couldn't be stamped out entirely. They might not have been heard in the drawing room, but in the nursery, after dark, stories and laughter found their way back. So when we think of seen but not heard, it's easy to imagine a cruel, joyless world. And yes, it was harsh, but it was also practical, born from big families, crowded rooms, and anxious parents who believed silence kept order. Still, for the children living through it, that order felt heavy. It felt like being small furniture in someone else's house, expected to look pretty but never make a sound. And if you survived the long day of silence, if you managed to make it through without sighing too loudly or sneezing at the wrong time, you'd tiptoe back upstairs at night, into the nursery, into the safety of your own little bed. There, in whispers, you might finally share a joke with your teddy bear, tell a secret to your sister, or giggle into your pillow. And for a moment, just before sleep, you'd remember what it felt like to be a child again. If the Victorian nursery was a miniature fortress, then the nanny was its commanding officer. Forget the image of a kindly babysitter reading fairy tales by the fire. A Victorian nanny was something else entirely, part drill sergeant, part mother substitute, part warden. She was the one who set the rhythm of your days, who decided when you rose, when you ate, when you studied, when you were punished, and when you might, just might, be allowed to play. Parents may have owned the house, but the nanny ruled the nursery, and in many homes, she was the person children knew best. Imagine seeing your mother only for a brief goodnight kiss through the crack of a door, or a quick pat on the head before she left for a social visit. Father, he was a distant figure, looming at the end of the dinner table, or hidden behind a newspaper. But Nanny was always there. Morning, noon, and night. Her footsteps echoed in the nursery like a metronome ticking away your childhood. She was usually an older woman, unmarried, with a uniform as rigid as her schedule, starched black dress, crisp white apron, hair pulled back so tightly it could slice paper, keys jangling from her belt like warning bells. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, could freeze milk at 20 paces. Some children swore she could sense fun from 3 rooms away. If you so much as thought about laughing when you weren't supposed to, Nanny would appear in the doorway, arms folded, ready to extinguish the spark. And oh, the schedule she kept. The day began at 7 sharp, no excuses. Breakfast at the table, lessons at 8, a brisk walk at 9, rain, shine, or thunderstorm. Handwriting drills followed by moral poetry recitations. Needlework for the girls, geography lessons for the boys, though both were expected to sit silently and stitch, copy, or memorize without a single complaint. If you had a spare moment, Nanny filled it with chores: dust the mantel, fold the linens, scrub your boots until she could see her reflection in them. Idle hands, she reminded you, ere the devil's workshop. She didn't need to shout, she didn't need to strike. Her weapons were subtler, sharper: a raised eyebrow, a sigh, a story whispered in a voice so low it chilled your bones. Once there was a boy who spoke out of turn, and do you know what became of him? The tale always ended with ruin, disgrace, or a life spent in debtor's prison. By the time she finished, you'd be begging her for forgiveness for crimes you hadn't even committed. Her medicine chest was a terror all its own. Neatly lined bottles of soothing syrups, laudanum, and cod liver oil gleamed like a row of soldiers waiting to be deployed. Toothache laudanum. Syrup thick with alcohol and morphine. Restless night. A spoonful of soothing, draught guaranteed to knock you out for hours, maybe days. The taste was dreadful, bitterness mixed with licorice and despair. But children quickly learned that protesting only made things worse. Many became expert at faking robust health just to avoid another spoonful. Better to endure the cough than face the cure. And yet, for all her severity, there were moments when the nanny almost seemed human. If you recited your lessons without a stumble, she might, on rare afternoons, read aloud from a book. Not fairy tales, of course, those were frivolous. Instead, moral stories where naughty children met grim fates and the virtuous were rewarded with modest joys like extra gruel. But even so, her voice softened slightly in those moments, and you could almost imagine she cared. Sometimes, if the household was unusually calm, she allowed you to play with the special toys. A battered set of wooden blocks, a puzzle missing half its pieces, a dollhouse with one wall permanently broken. They weren't much, but to a child under constant rules, they were treasures. And if you caught what looked like a twinkle in her eye as you built a crooked tower or invented a game, you convinced yourself it was real. That maybe, beneath all the starch and sternness, she did feel a trace of affection. But Nanny's affection was a double-edged sword, because she was everything: the disciplinarian, the caretaker, the storyteller, the enforcer of rules. She might be the one person you longed to please, and the one person you feared the most. For many children, she became more of a mother than their actual mothers, more present than anyone else in their world. And that bond, intense as it was, often ended abruptly. When you grew too old for the nursery, you were torn away from her without ceremony, thrust into the care of tutors, or sent off to boarding school. The woman who had shaped your earliest years was suddenly gone, and the absence left a wound that could ache for a lifetime. The rules she enforced went beyond behavior. She shaped how you thought about the world itself. Fresh air was essential, she said, so you were marched outside even in the rain, wrapped in layer after layer of wool. But sunshine was suspicious, too much heat leading to fainting fits. Food wasn't about taste, but about restraint. Cleanliness was close to godliness, though your weekly bath left you raw and shivering. Every act of daily life came with her voice hovering over it, telling you what it meant, what it proved, and what it would do to your character. And discipline, when it came, was rarely physical. She didn't need to swing a cane when a look would suffice. Instead, she used shame like a craftsman uses a chisel, carving obedience into you with silence, sighs, and icy stares. A punishment could be as simple as being ignored, the room growing 10 degrees colder as she carried on with her work without acknowledging you. That absence of attention, that withdrawal of her presence, could sting worse than any smack. For all of this, many children grew up with complicated feelings toward their nanny. They feared her, they resented her, and yet they loved her too, because she was often the only adult who truly knew them. She was the one who checked their fevers, who tied their shoes, who told them stories at night. She was the one who saw their tears, even if she told them to stop. That contradiction, harshness wrapped around care, was the essence of the Victorian nanny. And so, life under the nanny's rule book was a strange mixture of discipline and devotion, of fear and comfort. You tiptoed around her by day, but at night, when she tucked you in under layers of scratchy blankets, you might feel a fleeting sense of safety. Safe, at least, until morning when the schedule began again. Breakfast, lessons, walks, punishments. A childhood as regimented as a soldier's drill. That was the Victorian nanny, the iron hand in the starched glove, shaping children not just for survival but for silence, duty, and obedience. A figure so powerful in a child's memory that even as adults, they could still hear the echo of her footsteps, still feel the sting of her stare. She was both nightmare and anchor, a symbol of a childhood where love and fear were often impossible to separate. Bath night. Just the words were enough to strike dread into a Victorian child's heart. Today, most of us think of a bath as warm water, bubbles, scented soap, maybe even a moment of relaxation. Not so in the 1800s. For children back then, the weekly bath was a grim ritual, half medical procedure, half punishment, and entirely unforgettable. The ritual usually took place in the kitchen, where a tin tub would be dragged out and set near the stove. There was no private bathroom with shiny faucets, no hot water running at the turn of a handle. Instead, kettles were boiled, pails filled, and water sloshed from pot to pot. You could hear the clatter and hiss as hot water met cold, steam rising into the chilly air. The sound was both comforting and ominous, the promise of warmth, paired with the certainty of scrubbing until your skin was raw. Children lined up, each waiting their turn. Being first was a blessing. You got the cleanest, hottest water, still smelling faintly of iron from the kettle. Being last was a curse. By then, the tub had turned into what could only be described as a family soup. A cloudy broth tinged grey with dirt, soap, scum, and whatever floated off your siblings. A button, a crumb from yesterday's pudding, a suspicious hair. You never knew what you'd find bobbing near your knees. Soap was no comfort either. The pride of modern chemistry, carbolic soap, looked pure and white, but felt like sandpaper dipped in pine resin. It stripped away dirt, yes, but it also stripped away layers of skin. Children squirmed and winced as the soap was rubbed over arms, necks, behind ears. Any attempt to wriggle free earned a sharp rebuke. Stand still. Be grateful. Cleanliness builds character. Hair washing. That was rare, reserved for outbreaks of lice, high holidays, or the occasional visit from a very stern grandmother. Most of the time, the scalp was scrubbed dry with a stiff brush, the kind meant to stimulate roots, but mostly succeeded in spreading the itch evenly. If you complained, you were met with stories about Great Aunt Bessie, who only bathed once a year and lived to 93. Whether out of spite or sheer toughness, nobody knew. Bath night was also a public event. Privacy was not a luxury children were given. Nanny or mother stood nearby, sleeves rolled up, soap and cloth in hand. Brothers and sisters loitered, waiting their turn, snickering at your red cheeks or shrieks as icy rinse water was poured over your head from a jug. Towels were scratchy, always slightly damp, no matter how long they hung by the stove, and they smelled faintly of mildew. And then came the inspections. Once scrubbed, you weren't simply declared clean. No, you were examined like a soldier at roll call. Arms stretched out, hands checked for dirt under nails. Behind ears inspected, any suspicious mark, a rash, a scratch, a bruise, was noted aloud, sometimes treated with iodine, sometimes dabbed with mysterious ointments that burned more than they healed. Cuts were disinfected with gin, wounds bandaged with linen strips, and you were reminded that every mark on your skin told a story about your moral character. Children, of course, hated it. They dreaded the sting of soap, the exposure, the endless scrubbing. But to adults, bath night was a source of pride. Cleanliness, they said, was not only next to godliness, it was proof of good parenting. A child who smelled of pine tar and vinegar water was a child prepared for life's hardships. There was another layer to all this, though superstition. Many Victorians believed too much bathing was unhealthy. Too much hot water could weaken the constitution, sap the body's strength, invite illness. So while the bath was dreaded, it was also rare. Once a week, sometimes once every 2 weeks, daily baths. That would have been seen as bizarre, even dangerous, which meant most of the time, children walked around with a thin layer of dirt, which adults actually believed offered protection from disease. The whole ordeal could last hours. One child scrubbed, rinsed, inspected, dried, then the next, and the next. By the time the last sibling emerged, shivering and red-skinned, the water was cold and the kitchen filled with steam. You climbed into a fresh nightshirt, not fresh by modern standards, but at least not yet falling apart, and you went to bed smelling faintly of tar, soap, and boiled cabbage. Bath night didn't guarantee cleanliness. By morning, most children were dirty again. A tumble in the yard, a game in the soot-filled street, a climb up the chimney for the poorer kids. All of it undid hours of scrubbing, but that wasn't really the point. Bath night wasn't about staying clean. It was about discipline. It was about ritual. It was about teaching children to endure discomfort with patience, to accept sting and scratch as normal. Still, there were small silver linings. Bath night was one of the few times children could overhear adult gossip. Standing in line, wrapped in a blanket, you could catch whispers about neighbors, scandals, or news from the city. Sometimes, if you were clever, you floated bread crusts or bits of wood in the tub, turning them into boats before being scolded. And afterward, tucked into bed, you might feel a rare sense of relief. Another ordeal survived, another badge of resilience earned. Looking back, it's hard not to marvel at how different these nights were from our own. Today, kids splash in warm tubs with bubbles and toys, wrapped in fluffy towels afterward. Back then, it was grit, sting, and grey water. Yet Victorian children grew up tough. They learned to face cold, to endure discomfort, to survive with dignity. Bath night was less about soap and water, and more about survival. It was about training kids to handle life's hardships, starting with a tin tub and a bar of carbolic soap. And if you made it through the night without screaming too loudly, if you endured the sting of vinegar rinses and the rough rub of damp towels, you went to bed a little raw, a little sore, but oddly proud. Because in the Victorian world, survival itself was a kind of victory. Playtime. In theory, it should have been the brightest part of a Victorian child's day, a chance to laugh, run, and forget the endless rules of silence and discipline. But like everything else in the Victorian world, play came with rules, warnings, and a fair share of danger lurking just beneath the surface. Toys weren't about joy, they were about lessons, and sometimes those lessons left scars, both literal and figurative. For wealthy families, the nursery was stocked with expensive toys, crafted with care and often painted in brilliant colours. Wooden rocking horses stood proudly in corners, their manes carefully carved, their saddles painted in detail. Dollhouses, miniature mansions in their own right, were furnished with tiny chairs, tables, and porcelain dishes. Tin soldiers stood in rows, ready to reenact battles from Britain's growing empire. On the surface, it all seemed magical, almost luxurious. But here's the catch: those same rocking horses were coated in lead paint that chipped into little hands. The dollhouse furniture gleamed with bright dyes made from arsenic and mercury. The tin soldiers, favourites of countless little boys, were made of soft lead, easy to chew and even easier to swallow. Alphabet blocks, toys meant to teach letters and spelling, were painted with the same toxic paints. So while a child might spend hours arranging soldiers or building towers, every touch brought them closer to danger. Play was a hazard disguised as fun. And the dolls. Oh, the dolls. Victorian dolls were not soft and huggable like the plush toys of today. They were stiff, porcelain-faced creations with glass eyes that followed you around the room. Their expressions were less cheerful and more haunting, as though they knew your secrets and might whisper them to Nanny when you weren't looking. Some were even made with real human hair, which raised more questions than comfort. Children loved them, feared them, or both at once. Many later swore those dolls gave them nightmares that lingered well into adulthood. Even toys that seemed harmless carried risks. Jack-in-the-boxes popped open with a force that could startle a child into tears. Marbles, beautiful and shiny, chipped teeth or vanished down throats. Hoops for rolling looked innocent until you remembered Victorian houses were filled with priceless vases, narrow hallways, and furniture waiting to trip you. Needlework kits, given to little girls to teach useful skills, involved sharp needles, flimsy cloth, and endless opportunities for pricked fingers. And of course, play itself was never truly free. Wealthy children were watched constantly, their games supervised, their noise levels measured. A game of blind man's bluff. Too chaotic. A rowdy laugh. Too unladylike. Toys were supposed to be admired, not enjoyed. In some homes, favourite toys were locked away in cabinets, only brought out on special occasions and only after solemn promises to behave. Imagine waiting all week for the chance to hold your Noah's Ark set, then being told you could only use it if you didn't drown the camels this time. For poorer children, play looked very different. There were no painted dollhouses, no rocking horses, no tin soldiers lined up on shelves. Instead, games were improvised from whatever the street offered. A stick became a sword, a hoop from a barrel became a racing toy, pebbles or bottle caps turned into marbles, old rags were stitched into makeshift dolls. Fun wasn't bought in a shop, it was scavenged, invented, passed down from older siblings. But poor children often had little time for play at all. By the age of 5 or 6, many were already working, sweeping chimneys, hauling coal, or running errands for long hours. Play might mean racing down alleys during a stolen lunch break, or making a game out of dodging horse carts in the street. And in those streets, danger was everywhere, carriages barreling past, pickpockets lurking, puddles of mysterious substances best not stepped in. Play wasn't just fun, it was survival practice. Yet, rich or poor, children found ways to make joy out of their circumstances. Siblings staged miniature battles with blocks. Girls gathered for tea parties with haunted-eyed dolls. Street kids turned alleys into obstacle courses and rooftops into playgrounds. And late at night, when adults had finally left them alone, whispers of laughter and giggles filled the nursery, proving that even the strictest rules couldn't completely silence childhood. But make no mistake, play was never entirely safe. Every toy carried risk, every laugh risked a scolding, and every stolen moment of fun risked discovery. Yet maybe that's what made those moments so powerful. They weren't just games, they were rebellions, little acts of resistance against a world that tried to keep children quiet, obedient, and still. And so, the Victorian playroom became a paradox, a place of wonder and of warning, of treasures and of traps. For the lucky, it held painted horses and porcelain dolls. For the poor, it was the open street. But in every case, it carried danger. And yet, through it all, kids found ways to laugh, to imagine, and to cling to the small spark of joy that no nanny, no parent, no poisoned toy could ever fully extinguish. Because in the end, that's what childhood always does. It finds the cracks in the rules, the secret spaces where play survives. Even in a nursery filled with arsenic wallpaper and haunted dolls, joy slipped through, if only for a moment. Fresh air. In the Victorian mind, it was the cure to just about everything. Stuffy rooms were blamed for fevers, bad tempers, poor digestion, and even moral decay. To the adults of the time, no child could grow up strong without constant exposure to fresh air. And they meant constant. Rain, shine, frost, or fog. It didn't matter. You were bundled in layers, marched outdoors, and told to breathe deeply. But when yards and gardens weren't available, when families lived in crowded city apartments, Victorians invented a strange, unsettling solution: the baby cage. Yes, you heard that right. Wire cages, bolted to the outside of buildings, dangling several stories above the street, each one holding a swaddled child. It sounds like something out of a dark comedy sketch, but it was real. Imagine looking up at a row of sooty brick apartments in London and seeing cages jutting out like little balconies, each one stuffed with an infant blinking at the sky. or at the pigeons circling overhead. The logic behind it was simple. Stale indoor air was seen as dangerous. Sunlight and breezes, even ones mixed with smoke and coal dust, were believed to build strong lungs and rosy cheeks. And so mothers and nannies, with the best of intentions, strapped their babies into wire boxes and hung them outside windows like potted plants. The neighbours weren't always thrilled. More than one passerby threatened to report families to the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. But to many parents, it was considered responsible, even loving. Picture yourself as one of those children. You're wrapped in layers of wool, so many layers you look less like a baby and more like a stuffed turnip. Nanny carries you through the parlour, past curious relatives, and without ceremony slides you into the cage. The door clanks shut. And then suddenly you're outside, staring at the city below. Carts rattle by. Horses snort. Laundry flaps on lines stretched across the alley. A pigeon lands on the cage bars and cocks its head at you. The air is chilly, smelling faintly of coal smoke and manure, but everyone around insists it's doing you good. From your little prison of wire and cloth, you catch sight of other babies, each hanging from their own family's window. You stare at each other with the unspoken solidarity of shared suffering. One gnaws on her mitten, another cries, his voice swallowed by the city's clamour. Somewhere below, a street urchin points up and laughs. You blink, sneeze, and wish desperately for something to hold. Of course, the system wasn't perfect. Faulty latches, strong winds, or poorly secured cages sometimes led to accidents. Stories whispered about babies retrieved from hedges, laundry lines, or even the roofs of passing carriages. But most of the time, the cages held firm. Children were brought back inside after their allotted time, their cheeks pink, their hair coated in a fine layer of soot. Parents beamed, convinced they had toughened their little ones against illness. And illness was always the great fear. Tuberculosis haunted Victorian families. So did rickets, scarlet fever, diphtheria, names that carried dread in every home. Anything that promised to strengthen a child's constitution, no matter how bizarre, was worth a try. And fresh air seemed harmless enough. Better, they thought, to risk the odd pigeon attack than to raise a child weakened by indoor air. Not every child was subjected to the cage, of course. It was more common in urban areas, where cramped apartments left no space for gardens. Wealthy families in the countryside simply bundled their children in blankets and wheeled them out into the yard. No matter the weather, babies were left napping in prams under drizzle, snow, or sharp winds. It builds fortitude, the adults declared. Cold air toughens the skin, strengthens the lungs, keeps away disease. And so children coughed, sneezed, shivered, but rarely stayed indoors. The obsession with fresh air spilled into every part of childhood. Bedrooms were left unheated, windows cracked even in the dead of winter. Children were scolded for hiding under blankets, told instead to breathe in the cold night air, as if it were medicine. If you protested, you were reminded that weakness was shameful and that your ancestors had survived harsher climates without complaint. Even outdoor walks were less about fun than about moral duty. Nanny marched you in stiff formation down the street, umbrella tucked under her arm like a sabre, while you waddled in boots too heavy and coats too thick to let you run. You longed to splash in puddles or chase the dog that darted ahead, but any attempt at fun was met with sharp words. Not so fast. Breathe properly. Stand tall. Even leisure was regimented in the name of health. Back to the cages for a moment. It's worth noting we didn't fade immediately with the Victorian era. The idea persisted into the early 20th century, gaining brief popularity even among modern families. Eleanor Roosevelt herself once tried one for her daughter, suspending the child outside a New York apartment window. Neighbors were horrified. But to Roosevelt, it was common sense. Babies needed sunlight and air. She wasn't alone. Parents across Europe and America experiment with similar contraptions, all chasing that same old Victorian dream of raising strong, resilient children through the magic of fresh air. Looking back, it's both absurd and strangely logical. Absurd because dangling a baby over city streets seems reckless at best, cruel at worst. Logical because in a time when medicine was shaky and diseases rampant, parents clung to anything that promised safety. They weren't trying to hurt their children. They were trying to help, using the tools and beliefs they had. And so the baby cage became a symbol of Victorian parenting itself, bizarre, well-intentioned, and often dangerous. Children dangled above the chaos of the city, learning resilience not by choice but by design. They grew up tougher, perhaps, but also with a lifelong suspicion of window ledges and wire mesh. If you survived your stint as a human window ornament, you returned indoors pink-cheeked and suit-dusted, praised for your sturdy constitution. Parents congratulated themselves. Nanny nodded with satisfaction, and you, still sniffling, still blinking at the memory of pigeons pecking near your face, wondered what exactly you had done to deserve such treatment. But that was Victorian logic in a nutshell. Hardship builds character. Cold air makes you strong, and a child's comfort is less important than their endurance. Even if endurance meant spending your mornings suspended in a cage, breathing in coal smoke and pigeon feathers. If breakfast was the first test of the day and silence the second, then punishment was the ever-present threat hanging over every Victorian child. Discipline wasn't occasional, it was constant. It wasn't hidden in the shadows. It was proudly displayed, embroidered on cushions, written into family rules, and whispered into bedtime prayers. Spare the rod, spoil the child wasn't just a proverb. It was a philosophy, one that shaped every corner of a child's life. From the moment you woke in the nursery, you lived under an invisible set of laws. Sit up straight, don't fidget, don't laugh too loudly, walk softly, keep your hands folded, don't speak unless spoken to, don't let your shoes scuff, don't spill your milk, don't stare too long at the biscuits. Every misstep had a consequence, and consequences came quickly. You didn't have the luxury of thinking, will they punish me for this? The better question was, how will they punish me for this? The arsenal of punishment was impressive in its variety. Wooden spoons, hairbrushes, canes, slippers. Each had its place, its particular use. A wooden spoon might sting across the knuckles for a careless spill. A slipper might swat for mischief at bedtime. The cane was reserved for serious infractions, talking back, disobedience, or the ultimate crime, disrespecting an elder. Even the hairbrush, meant to smooth tangles, doubled as a weapon of correction. To a Victorian child, no object was ever just itself. Everything could be repurposed as a lesson, but punishment didn't always mean a smack. Often, the psychological weapons were sharper. There was the reflection chair, a stiff, backed seat placed in a corner, usually beneath a portrait of some stern ancestor glaring down from the frame. You sat there, hands on knees, staring at the wallpaper or the floor, meant to contemplate your sins. Sometimes you were made to recite a moral poem aloud as you sat, your voice breaking, your words echoing through the room like a confession. There were public lectures too. A father could talk for half an hour about the dangers of talking too much, linking your chatter to the downfall of Rome, the decline of society, and the eternal disgrace of noisy children. You sat silently while the words washed over you, cheeks burning, siblings pretending not to smirk. Mother's punishments were subtler. A sigh, heavy and disappointed, could crush your spirit more than any smack. The Victorians believed deeply in shame, and shame became the most powerful tool in their kit. Sometimes, punishment turned into performance. At supper, your small mistake of the day, a muddy footprint, a giggle during grace, a botched recitation, might be announced before the whole family. Everyone would look at you, waiting for your apology. You would stammer it out, cheeks red, while siblings silently thanked heaven it wasn't them this time. Grandmother might shake her head, declaring that standards had slipped since her day. The family dog might even give you a judgmental look, or at least it felt that way. Even objects around the house carried warning power. Some families kept an official punishment chair, a kind of throne of disgrace, stationed under the sternest family portrait they could find. Others had specific corners of rooms designated for standing in silence. Certain books were used as disciplinary tools, the Book of Virtues, Pilgrim's Progress, or long moral poems copied out as punishment lines until hands cramped. A dull, endless exercise in handwriting was as dreaded as any spanking. But as harsh as all this was, rewards existed too. They were rare, rationed out like sugar, but they were powerful. Sometimes a piece of toffee, sometimes a penny, sometimes, most thrilling of all, a single word of praise. Well done. Those 2 words could carry a child for a week. Imagine living in a world where a smile from father or a nod from mother was more valuable than any toy. Rewards weren't just candy. They were validation, proof that you had managed, for a brief moment, to live up to impossible standards. The line between punishment and reward was razor thin. One wrong word could turn a smile into a glare. One forgotten "thank you" could cancel out a week's worth of perfect posture. The system kept children in constant tension, balancing on the edge of shame and praise, always guessing, always second-guessing. And yet, like every part of Victorian childhood, it wasn't born purely from cruelty. Parents genuinely believed this was love. Discipline, they said, built character. Punishment taught virtue. Hardship forged resilience. A child raised without correction would grow wild, selfish, sinful. They weren't trying to break their children. They were trying to save them. At least, that's what they told themselves. Still, for the child sitting in the corner, reciting a poem about humility through tears, or rubbing a stinging hand after a smack with the spoon, it didn't feel like salvation. It felt like fear. It felt like powerlessness. It felt like growing up in a world where affection always came with conditions. And here's the strange paradox again: despite the strict punishments, despite the endless rules, children survived. They found ways to laugh, to rebel in small, secret ways. They whispered jokes after lights out. They plotted with siblings, covering for one another when mischief went wrong. They learned to negotiate, to bargain. "I'll take an extra helping of cabbage if you skip the lecture." They became strategists, masters of reading moods, calculating just how far they could push before the wooden spoon appeared. Punishment shaped them, yes, but it also taught them cunning. It taught them resilience. And sometimes, it even taught them solidarity, because nothing unites siblings faster than a shared fear of nanny's glare or father's lecture. So the punishments and rewards of Victorian parenting weren't just about behavior. They were about survival. Every day was a balancing act, a tightrope walk between shame and approval. And if you made it through without too many scoldings, without too much disgrace, you counted it as a victory. That was the rhythm of the Victorian home rules: discipline, correction, and the occasional sweet reward. It may seem cruel to us now, even abusive by modern standards. But in their minds it was order. It was love. It was the only way to raise children in a world they believed was filled with danger and sin. If there was one part of the Victorian household that could truly terrify a modern parent, it wasn't the nursery rules, the wooden spoon, or even the haunted-eyed dolls. It was the medicine chest. Every home had one, and inside those neat rows of bottles and jars lurked enough danger to make today's pharmacists faint. The Victorian medicine cabinet wasn't a collection of cures. It was a Pandora's box of poisons, patent medicines, and desperate guesses, all offered with the best intentions and the worst results. Remember, this was an age when medical science was still stumbling in the dark. Germ theory was barely understood. Doctors still relied on leeches, bleeding, and poultices made from herbs and lard. Regulations? None. If someone could mix a concoction, slap a label on it, and make it sound miraculous, they could sell it. And sell it they did, door to door, in pharmacies, in newspapers, with ads promising instant relief for every ailment under the sun. Parents, desperate to soothe a teething child or calm a fussy baby, bought them by the bottle. The most infamous of these was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. It was marketed as a miracle cure for teething, fussiness, and nervousness. The bottle's label promised peace and quiet, a baby who would sleep through the night, and parents who could finally rest. And in a way, it delivered. But the secret ingredient wasn't magic. It was morphine. 1 teaspoon of this syrup contained about 65 milligrams of morphine. To put that in perspective, that's the equivalent of 20 drops of laudanum, or enough to sedate, not soothe, a grown adult. Parents were instructed to give their babies 1 teaspoon 3 or 4 times a day. And if it didn't work, the instructions encouraged increasing the dose. Imagine the horror, well-meaning mothers spooning this syrup into their babies' mouths, watching them finally quiet down, never realizing they were poisoning them. Deaths were common. Some estimates suggest up to 16% of infant deaths attributed to mysterious teething troubles were actually overdoses of soothing syrups like this. Parents often blamed themselves, thinking they hadn't given enough, when in truth they had given too much. Yet the product stayed on the market for decades, until regulations finally caught up in the early 1900s. And Mrs. Winslow's syrup was only the beginning. Every Victor home had laudanum, a powerful mixture of opium and alcohol. It was cheap, available everywhere, and used for everything: pain, coughs, diarrhea, sleeplessness, even anxiety. Adults took it daily, and children were given smaller doses without hesitation. A toothache, laudanum. A fever, laudanum. A restless night, laudanum. It dulled pain, yes, but it also created addiction, stupor, and far too often death. The shelves also held mercury ointments, smeared onto cuts, scrapes, or rashes. Mercury, toxic even in small amounts, was believed to draw out sickness. In practice, it poisoned the skin and weakened the body. Then there were hot mustard plasters slapped onto chests to draw out illness. Imagine the sting of mustard burning into tender skin, leaving rashes in the name of health. For bruises, the cure was goose fat. For coughs, a syrup laced with chloroform. For constipation, castor oil, the most dreaded of all, not because it was deadly, but because it was unforgettable. The family doctor's black bag was no safer. It rattled with forceps, bottles, powders, and of course, jars of leeches. Children feared the doctor not just because of his tools, but because his treatments almost always hurt more than the illness. A stomach ache might mean a blister plaster. A fever might mean being blood. Even the modern remedies often seemed cruel: vinegar rubs, garlic necklaces, tar ointments. The line between medicine and superstition blurred constantly. And then there were the powders. Cooling powders for fussy babies, teething powders for sore gums, nervous powders for anxious children. What did they contain? Opium, morphine, alcohol, and a touch of pleasant herbs to disguise the bitterness. Parents swore by them, children swallowed them, and the results were as unpredictable as rolling dice. Sometimes the powders soothed, sometimes they knocked the child unconscious. Sometimes, tragically, they silenced them forever. Imagine standing in front of that cabinet as a child. The bottles lined up neatly, their labels written in ornate script: elixir of calm, cordial of briskness, soothing syrup, healing salve. To you, they looked like magic potions. To your parents, they were miracles in glass. But to modern eyes, they were a minefield. Even minor wounds became dramas. A scraped knee wasn't just rinsed and bandaged. It was doused with iodine or carbolic acid, leaving you screaming louder than when you fell. A bruise earned a rub-down with goose fat or butter, as though turning you into a walking roast would help. A cough meant spoonfuls of dark, bitter syrup that tasted like despair and smelled like a distillery. And if you protested, you were scolded for being ungrateful. "It's for your own good," they said, words that have haunted children across centuries. And yet, beneath the horror, it's important to remember these parents weren't monsters. They were scared. Illness was everywhere. Infant mortality was staggering. Diseases we barely think about today, measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, could wipe out entire families. Doctors offered little certainty. Science was still crawling toward the light. Parents clung to anything that promised hope, even if that hope came bottled with poison. Looking back, it's easy to shudder at the thought of babies dosed with morphine, toddlers rubbed with mercury, children bleeding from leech bites. But in those dimly lit nurseries, with mothers and nannies desperate to quiet a feverish cry, those bottles represented love, not malice. Misguided love, tragic love, but love all the same. And somehow, children survived. They coughed, they slept, they endured plasters and syrups. They built resilience not because the medicine worked, but because childhood itself demanded resilience. They learned to fake health to avoid another spoonful. They learned to grimace through the sting of iodine. They learned that survival meant not just braving the illnesses of the age, but braving the cures as well. The Victorian medicine chest, then, was less a source of healing than a symbol of fear. Fear of sickness, fear of loss, fear that without constant intervention, children wouldn't survive. And though those bottles contained poison more often than cure, they were held and poured with trembling hands full of hope. So picture it: the flickering gaslight, the shadowed nursery, the row of bottles gleaming like soldiers in a line. A child coughing in bed, a mother measuring out syrup with a shaky hand, a nanny watching, keys clinking at her waist. The spoon lifts, the child swallows, and for a while silence returns. Not health, not true healing, but silence. And in the Victorian world, sometimes silence was enough to count as victory. If the nursery was the training ground, then school was the battlefield. Growing up Victorian meant stepping out of your lace-trimmed childhood prison and into an even stricter arena, the classroom. Education wasn't about discovery or creativity. It was about order, about obedience, about shaping boys and girls into very specific molds, each with their own rules, their own duties, and their own lifelong limitations. Your first encounter with school was the sound of the bell, sharp, shrill, relentless. It rang out at dawn, calling children from every street, every alley, every grand house and tiny attic. Whether you wore polished shoes or bare feet, the sound meant the same thing: lessons were about to begin. You filed into the schoolyard or the cramped classroom, uniforms starched, collars stiff, hair combed until your scalp stung. No one asked if you were ready. Readiness didn't matter. Attendance mattered. Posture mattered. Silence mattered. The schoolroom itself was no place of comfort. Imagine rows of wooden desks, narrow and splintery, each one with an ink pot that leaked at the worst possible moment. Chalk dust floated in the air. The windows let in drafts in winter and unbearable heat in summer. If you were lucky, there might be a fireplace in the corner, but the fire was usually so small it warmed no one except the teacher. You sat shivering or sweating, or both, with a slate on your desk and a stub of chalk in your hand. The curriculum was a relentless parade of memorization. Multiplication tables recited forward and backward. Long passages of moral poetry, copied until your fingers cramped. History lessons that boiled down to lists of kings, battles, and dates. Geography, where the world map was painted pink wherever the British Empire ruled. A constant reminder of who was in charge. Latin was compulsory for boys, taught with all the joy of a funeral. You might not understand a single line, but you learned to conjugate until you dreamed of verbs in your sleep. Teachers weren't gentle guides, they were wardens. Mr. Snipe, the mathematics master, had an uncanny ability to appear behind you the moment your attention drifted. Miss Grimshaw, the writing mistress, could spot a crooked letter at 30 paces. They carried canes, rulers, and dunce caps, and they used them. A wrong answer could earn you a smack. A sloppy page could buy you an hour of extra copy work. A daydream caught mid-lesson might result in public humiliation. Standing before the class with the dunce cap perched on your head while your classmates tried not to laugh. Lunchtime was no reprieve. For poorer children, it meant a crust of bread, maybe a wedge of cheese, maybe nothing at all. Wealthier children had packed lunches, but even those were plain bread and butter, perhaps a cold slice of meat. Meals weren't about enjoyment, only sustenance. And as you chewed, you kept one ear open for the teacher's call, because discipline didn't stop just because your stomach was busy. Playtime existed, but like everything else, it came with rules. Outdoor games were meant to be healthful, marching in circles, hopping in neat rows, or carefully supervised skipping rope. Anything loud or chaotic, shouting, running wildly, laughing too much was discouraged. For working-class children, playtime often meant the streets dodging horses, playing with sticks, or chasing each other through alleys. For the wealthy, it was croquet on manicured lawns or doll parades in drawing rooms. Different worlds, but the same lesson play was tolerated only as long as it reinforced discipline. And then came the divide. Boys and girls didn't just sit in different classrooms. They were educated for different lives. For boys, school was rigorous, often cruel, designed to build robust men ready for the empire. Latin declensions, algebra, cricket played in the rain until your fingers went numb. Fighting was overlooked, even expected, so long as it built toughness. A boy who wept was mocked. A boy who faltered was punished. School was as much about teaching stoicism as it was about teaching facts. By the time you left, you were supposed to be a gentleman, or at least look like one, starched collar and all. For girls, the path was narrower. Many were sent to finishing schools, places where education meant embroidery, piano practice, and French phrases about the weather. The goal wasn't knowledge but polish. Could you pour tea gracefully? Could you faint elegantly at the mention of Paris? Could you paint roses in watercolor without smudging your gloves? That was education for girls' accomplishments, not independence. Arithmetic was minimal. Science was rare. Literature was carefully filtered. The lesson was clear: your future lay in the drawing room, not in the lecture hall. And yet, in both worlds, emotional repression was central. Boys were told never to cry, except perhaps if hit squarely with a cricket ball, and even then, preferably in Latin. Girls were taught to swallow their feelings, to faint rather than fume, to weep quietly into handkerchiefs instead of speaking their minds. Expression was dangerous. Silence was virtue, but children are children, and rebellion found cracks in the system. Boys traded novels under desks, smuggled penny dreadfuls into dormitories, and carved initials into desks with contraband penknives. Girls whispered forbidden stories about adventurous women, swapped secret sketches, or practiced laughter in private when no one was listening. The rules were strict, but imagination was stubborn. For poor families, school wasn't always an option. Many children went to work instead, scrubbing floors, hauling coal, or climbing into chimneys. Education, when it came, was charity or Sunday school, brief and basic. Lessons were rushed, materials scarce, discipline just as strict. But even those scraps of education could feel like treasures, glimpses of a wider world beyond endless labor. And always, hovering over every child, rich or poor, was the sense that childhood wasn't meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to be endured. School wasn't about learning who you were. It was about preparing you to be who society demanded you to be. And somehow children survived it. They endured the cold classrooms, the cane, the endless copy work. They learned to read, to write, to calculate. They learned when to keep quiet, when to sneak a smile, when to tuck away their true selves until adulthood gave them a sliver more freedom. So, growing up Victorian was a daily balancing act between obedience and rebellion, between silence and expression, between the rigid expectations of adults and the wild sparks of childhood that refused to die. And if you managed to get through school and daily life without losing that spark entirely, you carried it with you into adulthood. A reminder that even in the strictest, harshest environments, children find ways to laugh, to dream, and to survive. Life in the Victorian nursery wasn't just a cycle of rules, punishments, and lessons. It had its seasons, its holidays, and its little bursts of magic. But even the moments meant for joy carried the fingerprints of strict order, and always in the background, superstition hummed like a quiet song that never really stopped. To be a child, then, was to live inside a web of tradition, anxiety, and ritual, where Christmas lights flickered dangerously on real candles and Halloween whispers carried the weight of ghosts. Let's start with Christmas, because few events in the Victorian calendar loomed larger. Forget the avalanche of presents and plastic toys that modern children expect. A Victorian Christmas was a mix of austerity and abundance, sentimental warmth tied up with strict rules. The season began weeks ahead with the whole household polishing and dusting the drawing room, hanging sprigs of holly and mistletoe, and debating which ornaments were least likely to poison the cat. The centerpiece, of course, was the Christmas tree, imported from Germany and popularized by Queen Victoria herself. It stood proudly in the corner, branches prickly, ornaments delicate, and real candles clipped to the boughs. Imagine the entire family gathered around, eyes shining as the flames danced, while a bucket of sand and a jug of water waited nervously nearby. Fire hazard, absolutely. Tradition, unshakable. On Christmas morning, children woke trembling with excitement and cold in equal measure. They crept downstairs, not to mountains of presents, but to one or two modest gifts. A painted wooden toy, a knitted scarf, and most magical of all, a single orange, shining bright in the dim morning light. That orange was no ordinary fruit. It was a treasure, a symbol of luxury, sometimes the only sweet thing a child would taste all year. Imagine unpeeling it slowly, savoring each bite, while your siblings watched jealously for their turn. The feast that followed was overwhelming in its own way. Roast goose or turkey, mountains of potatoes, mincemeat pies, and, towering above all else, the Christmas pudding. Dosed in brandy, set aflame at the table, it glowed as the family clapped and children gasped. Someone always tried to extinguish the flames with a lace napkin, and someone always failed. Adults toasted Queen and country. Children were reminded to eat politely, not too fast and certainly not too noisily. Joy, yes, but controlled joy. And then came the parlour games. Charades, dramatic readings of Dickens, card games that ended in arguments about rules no one fully understood. Sometimes carols were sung, often off-key, sometimes accompanied by a reluctant cousin on the pianoforte. Bedtime came late, but not without a reminder of virtue, a prayer, a lecture on gratitude, and perhaps a cautionary tale about greedy children who received only coal. Even at Christmas, the lesson was clear: be grateful, be silent, be good. But Christmas wasn't the only highlight. Easter brought its own traditions, from new Sunday clothes to boiled eggs dyed with simple pigments. Birthdays were smaller, sometimes barely acknowledged, sometimes marked with a cake and a stern reminder that growing older also meant growing more responsible. And then there were the seasonal rhythms, the excitement of summer fairs, the chill of winter walks, the endless cycle of planting and harvest for rural families, when children's labour was needed as much as their laughter. Threaded through all of it was superstition. The Victorians loved a good ghost story, and they loved warnings even more. A dropped fork at dinner meant an unexpected visitor. Spilling salt required you to toss a pinch over your left shoulder, or risk inviting the devil himself. Never rock an empty cradle, they warned, or tragedy would follow. A black cat crossing your path wasn't just unlucky. It was a sign to turn around and reconsider every step you'd taken that day. Bedtime was the peak of superstition. The nursery, already gloomy with its arsenic wallpaper and watchful dolls, became a theatre for ghost stories. Older siblings whispered about haunted attics, wandering souls, and vengeful spirits who punished naughty children. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of candlelight became suspicious. You were told never to whistle indoors, it might summon spirits. Never look into a mirror at night. It was a doorway for ghosts. And if you sneezed 3 times in a row, you'd be handed bread and told to make the sign of the cross, just in case. Halloween, too, wasn't the candy-coated fun of today. It was a night heavy with superstition. Jack-o'-lanterns weren't cheerful. They were carved to frighten away real spirits believed to walk the earth. Children trembled at shadows, while adults traded stories of omens and unlucky signs. Even Christmas carried its share of ghost stories. Remember, Dickens's A Christmas Carol wasn't just fiction, it was tradition. Families gathered around the fire to share tales of the dead, their voices hushed, their eyes darting nervously at the windows. Even daily chores carried their rituals. Stirring the Christmas pudding had to be done clockwise for luck. Dreaming of teeth falling out was a bad omen. Don't tell anyone before breakfast, or disaster would come. Never open an umbrella indoors. Never step over a broom. And for heaven's sake, don't pick at your scabs, or the clergy might lose faith in you. Childhood was threaded with these warnings, each one a mix of fear, folklore, and parental anxiety. For children, these superstitions added a layer of mystery to an already rigid life. Yes, they were frightening. Yes, they could keep you awake at night, staring at shadows on the arsenic green wallpaper. But they also gave life texture. They made the ordinary extraordinary. A dropped spoon wasn't just clumsiness, it was fate. A sneeze wasn't just a tickle, it was a message. Even fear, in its own way, was a kind of entertainment. So, the seasons and holidays of Victorian childhood weren't just about breaks from routine. They were about rituals, both joyful and fearful. They were about oranges at Christmas, ghost stories at bedtime, Easter eggs cracked with laughter, and whispered warnings about omens in the dark. They gave children moments of magic, even if the magic was wrapped in cautionary tales and edged with danger. And through it all, the message remained the same: life was serious, even in play. Joy was permitted, but only with rules. Laughter was allowed, but only in moderation, and every celebration, every superstition, every seasonal rhythm reminded children that they lived in a world where danger was always near, but where survival, through obedience, resilience, and maybe just a little luck, was always possible. So here we are, at the end of a long Victorian childhood. We've tiptoed through the nursery, swallowed gruel, kept our mouths shut at the table, endured Nanny's sharp eyes, been scrubbed raw one bath night, played with poisonous toys, dangled in cages for the sake of fresh air, suffered punishment and the occasional sweet reward, swallowed bottles of opium disguised as medicine, trudged through schools and daily chores, marched through holidays wrapped in superstition, and somehow through all of it, children survived. That may be the strangest fact of all. Survival wasn't easy. The hazards were everywhere. Poisonous wallpaper shedding arsenic dust, toys coated in lead paint, medicines laced with morphine, food that starved more than it nourished, punishments that bruised both body and spirit. And yet, if you talk to descendants of that era, if you read the memoirs, you see the same pattern. Those children grew up. They endured. They carried scars. Yes, physical scars from injuries, emotional scars from shame and silence. But they also carried a toughness that shaped their adulthood. Victorian parents believed they were saving their children by making them suffer a little. Cold baths built character. Gruel taught humility. Silence trained obedience. Punishment instilled virtue. Medicine, even if dangerous, showed care. It's easy now to recoil, to say, how could they? But remember, they lived in constant fear. Disease took babies overnight. Poverty stalked families relentlessly. Death was never far from the nursery door. In that shadow, parents clung to whatever they thought would protect their children, even if protection came in the form of poison, or shame, or silence. And that's what makes the story of Victorian childhood so haunting. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was anxious love. It was misguided care. It was parents, nannies, and doctors doing their best with the tools they had, even when those tools were little more than superstition wrapped in a ribbon. To them, strictness was kindness. Hardship was love. Silence was safety. For the children, of course, it felt very different. Childhood wasn't about freedom or fun. It was about survival. You learned early to read moods, to anticipate punishments, to keep secrets, to find small, quiet rebellions. You learned how to smuggle joy into dark rooms. Giggles under blankets, whispered stories shared in the night, stolen moments of play with a stick or a marble. You learned that love was complicated, that it came dressed in lectures and sighs, but that it was there, even if hard to see. And here's the truth: despite the poisons and punishments, many Victorian children grew up resilient, tough, resourceful, endlessly inventive. They could face hardship without crumbling, endure boredom without complaint, find joy in scraps of play. They learned to survive in a world that often seemed designed to break them. And survival itself became their badge of honor. Think of the child who learned to eat gruel with silent dignity. The child who kept a poker face at the dinner table, avoiding shame. The child who outwitted Nanny's gaze, who found ways to laugh in secret, who endured the sting of iodine, who memorized endless moral poems. Those children grew into adults who carried resilience like armor. Adults who went on to work in factories, offices, shops, and ships, building the world of the 20th century with the stubborn toughness they'd learned in childhood. But not all lessons were good. Emotional repression left its mark. Many grew into adults unable to express affection easily, uncomfortable with joy, hesitant to share their feelings. The silence of childhood echoed through marriages, friendships, even parenthood. Trauma passed from generation to generation, softened perhaps, but still there. The haunted dolls may have been left behind, but the haunted faces lingered. And yet, there's something deeply human in all of this. Because even in the strictest homes, even under the harshest rules, children found ways to cling to life's small joys. A crust of bread shared with a sibling, a marble game in the dirt, the thrill of an orange at Christmas, the comfort of a whispered story in the dark. Those moments of joy mattered. They proved that no matter how controlling the adults were, childhood couldn't be entirely silenced. So when we look back at Victorian parenting, it's tempting to shake our heads and say, illegal today. And it would be, almost every practice, from the medicine chest to the baby cage, would draw the attention of child protective services. But it also reminds us how far we've come. We no longer dose babies with morphine, paint nurseries with arsenic, or scold children into silence. We understand now that love can be soft, that care can be safe, that childhood is a time to nurture, not just to discipline. And yet, their story also leaves us with a reminder that people, even in their strangest, most misguided moments, are always trying to do the best they can with what they know. The Victorians were anxious, fearful, overwhelmed. They clung to order and superstition because it gave them a sense of control. They weren't monsters. They were parents, worried about losing their children in a dangerous world. In their minds, the rules and the punishments were shields. What shines through, strangely enough, is hope. Hope that their children would survive. Hope that hardship would make them stronger. Hope that through discipline and sacrifice, they could raise better men and women. That hope was flawed, yes, but it was real. And so, the legacy of Victorian parenting isn't just cruelty or absurdity. It's resilience, it's survival, it's proof that even in the strangest, harshest systems, children find a way to grow, to laugh, to endure. It's a story of contradictions. Arsenic wallpaper and Christmas oranges, haunted dolls and whispered bedtime jokes, punishments and resilience. It's the story of childhood lived on the edge of danger, where survival itself was the greatest triumph. So as we close this long journey, imagine yourself tucking into bed in that Victorian nursery. The wallpaper glows faintly green in the moonlight. The fire is long gone out, and the room is cold. Nanny has whispered a stern prayer and closed the door. You lie still under layers of blankets, ears filled with the creaks of the old house, heart beating in the silence. You survived another day. Tomorrow will bring more rules, more gruel, more dangers. But for now, you close your eyes, whisper a secret joke into the pillow, and drift to sleep. And that, perhaps, is the heart of it all. Victorian parenting was bizarre, harsh, sometimes tragic. But childhood, even then, had its sparks of joy. Sparks that refused to die, even in the darkest, strictest rooms. Sparks that grew into resilience, into toughness, into the stubborn, hopeful human spirit. And that's why we tell these stories. Not to laugh at the past, not just to marvel at its absurdity, but to remember people have always tried to raise children the best they could. Sometimes they got it terribly wrong, but always underneath the rules and the fears, there was love. Complicated, misguided, but love all the same.